My dad grew up in Chicago and experienced his automotive coming of age in the 1960s. He quickly established himself as a sports car guy for some reason, which in the Midwest was pretty unusual in the 1960s because everybody was into American cars. And in those days in the Midwest, if the car was not American, it was just considered a foreign car, and it didn't matter if it was a Volvo or a VW or a Ferrari, it was just a foreign car. And so he had a lot of Triumphs and Jaguars and started driving Porsches and stuff like that. He bought the Miura because, well, if I'm honest, I think he probably bought one because Miles Davis had one. So his dad was a musician and a jazz musician, and so my dad spent a lot of time with various jazz musicians who, are still well known today in his youth. And so he spent time with Miles Davis, and they played trumpet together sometimes. And Miles Davis had a Miura, and he also had a 275 GTB4. And in all the dozens of foreign sports cars my dad had, the only two Italian cars he's ever owned, even to this day, are a 275 GTB and a Miura. Never any Alphas, never any Fiats, none of those sort of entry-level Italian cars. He just went straight to the big stuff. But, lots of base-level cars of other stuff like MGs and Triumph TR4s and an Austin Healey and SME types and stuff like that. Several Volvos also. So he bought the Miura, I think, because Miles Davis had one. Independent of that, obviously the Miura is such an icon. It's such an extraordinary car. It's so impactful. That it's hard to ignore, and if there's a way to own one, I can't imagine anybody who was into cars wouldn't want to. So he bought it in Italy. He flew to Italy and bought the car in 1974 and brought it back to Chicago with him, and drove it around there for a few years, where it had a number of fires, as Miuras are famous for doing, and the last one in 1979 was so severe that the car had to be more or less restored as a result. And that process started and then sort of paused and then started again. And then the car went to actually Bob Wallace, who was an original development engineer for the Miura, working at Lamborghini, down in, I think it was Phoenix. And eventually, when my dad moved to California in the late 70s, the car made its way there a few years later and was supposed to be restored in California, and the shop that it was at sort of did some stuff, but ultimately the car was off the road still when I was born in the late 80s, and all through my childhood, and it wasn't until I was in college that we finally started the restoration, after me begging him for essentially 15 years to restore the car. He almost sold it for $60,000 in 1994, which I'm glad he didn't. This car was sold new to a works Abarth racing driver named Franco Galli in 1968. He lived in the northern part of Italy, and he, while driving this car, at Monza, it experienced oil starvation, and he seized the motor, and he crashed the car. And they repaired it, and then I think he crashed the car again subsequently. And that time, the car was pretty heavily damaged, and so he had become friends with Ferruccio Lamborghini in the course, I think, of the early work that he did, or the early experience he had where he had oil starvation. He sort of volunteered to help Lamborghini do some engineering and development work on the car. And so he was friends with Lamborghini, and he said, hey, so I've destroyed my Miura, I would like another car. But if you could, I'd like to keep the same serial number so that I don't have to pay tax again. So that's what happened with this car. So this car is one of a handful of cars, and this did happen with several other cars, where it counts twice in the total production of, I think, the number is 762 Miuras. This car counts twice as both the 308th and 514th cars built. The car was originally green. The first car was green. The second car got, basically, as he described in a letter that he wrote to us maybe 10 years ago, it got the suspension and brakes from the old car, but most of the rest of it was new. And so and in both cases it was a Miura S, which is the sort of middle of the three variants of the primary variants of the Miura that were built. And so the second car was always yellow. But the Lamborghini production records indicate that this car was originally green because the first car with this serial number was in fact green. And so he owned the car for a while. He subsequently sold it to, I think it was some kind of broker, and the car passed through a few other owners in Italy. The second time it was built, it was completed in the summer of 1970. And my dad is actually not entirely sure, but his best guess is that he bought the car in the fall of 1974 in the region, in the area of Como, Italy. And he brought the car back with him to Illinois and drove it around there, where it was seen as more or less a spaceship. It is impossible for me to be objective about this car because we didn't have, he was not a collector. My parents were not car collectors. When I was a kid, he had one car, which was a Porsche 964 that he bought new, and it was his daily driver. That was the only car that he had. And so to know that we had somewhere, I never saw it because it was at this restoration shop, a Lamborghini Miura, which existed and was ours, but not running. It was a very odd experience as a child to think that there was such an important car that was in our life that just didn't exist in any meaningful or usable form. When I was in college, we started the restoration. We had a shop that we found to do the work, and they have obviously done a spectacular job. That was a process that took 12 years. It's now all basically finished. I'd say we restored it then because the car finally was worth enough where it made economic sense. For a long time, these cars were, quote, only $100,000, which is a lot of money objectively, but it's not. It still is worth less than the cost of a restoration. A lot of the parts are not available, and so they have to be made, and there's a lot of specialized expertise, and they're fairly mechanically sophisticated also, and so the rebuilding a quad cam V12 and a sidewinder transmission, sidewinder meaning the whole thing is transverse, it has always been an expensive undertaking, and for a long time the value of the car just didn't justify spending the money. My passion for cars was essentially inevitable. I say that because my dad was a huge car guy, and he started racing cars in the early 70s. And he picked up a couple of new Porsches at the factory and did European delivery. It was cheaper. I think the first one was in 1969, was a Tangerine 912 Targa. And that became his first race car, and he won an SCCA national championship driving that car in 1973. My parents met because he had listed that car for sale. At that point, it was a clapped-out race car, old race car, and my mom inquired about the car, and so I suppose it was inevitable that I became a car guy. The events of the world and the way that the world is shaking out, particularly at a time like this, throws into perspective how important cars are or aren't. In the general scheme of things, cars are not that important. As much as all of us who are enthusiasts love them, they are just things. And that is objectively true, and the real value of a car and how important it is comes from how it allows us to relate to other people. And so for me, the importance of this car is not that it is a Miura, it's that it is part of my family history. It's part of, I guess, my father's legacy in terms of just sort of having this be part of our lives.